Greetings, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you. My name is Dustin Cormier. This is another episode of How to Rock Astrology. Today we are going to be discussing the continuation of our evolutionary script. We've already at this point discussed pretty much the four main arcs of this evolutionary script. It's what I call the age-based astrological patterns. It's a group of patterns that happens to everybody at the same time in life. You can see my main video on this matter, and the actual thing that I've created. It looks a little bit like this. So we can see for everybody at these certain age brackets, something is happening, and each one of these is based on four different evolutionary arcs. And of course, today we're specifically going to be looking at the arc of Rahu and Ketu. That's the evolutionary nodes moving through what I call these quadrants. How these quadrants operate is that, as we can see here, this is our four major evolutionary arcs. We're mainly discussing the nodal transit periods today. Every 18 years, we experience a nodal return. Every 9 years, we experience a nodal opposition. Every 4.5 years, we experience a nodal square. So that is going to be the guts of our video today, is discussing these nodal quadrants. Now, keep your eyes peeled, because if you've been watching this far, then you're pretty far into this series. And I'd like to say at this point that I'm writing 2 books right now. One of them is autobiographical fiction about my own life, with some poetry interlaced. And then the second one's going to be a strictly poetry book. And then eventually I'd like to do an astrology book as well. So keep your eyes peeled for those. If you enjoyed this video in this series, you'll probably enjoy my other works. Now, let's dig into it here, folks. As I said, this is our evolutionary script, the age-based astrological patterns. And we're speaking to this specific part of it. It's the nodal transit periods today. And of course, this involves the consciousness of Rahu and Ketu. Rahu is the Vedic name of the north node of the moon, and Ketu is the Vedic name of the south node of the moon. Now, if you guys have been watching my other videos, you might have heard me discussing how Rahu kind of feels like summer camp. And when you are in Rahu-lands, when the north node eclipses are transiting in Rahu territory, in the north node territory. It's what we call summer camp, where you feel homesick. Ketu is more like being stuck at home. It's boring, it's stagnant, it's an energy that we have had enough of, or at least we feel like we have. Even though this whole life, we're going to be coming back and forth between summer camp and home, between Rahu and Ketu. So one of the points of this slide is what's one of my most key metaphors as we unfold what it means to be in Rahu territory and Ketu territory. How it often feels is Ketu is our root. It is our past life root. Until about the age of 36, we operate unconsciously through Ketu. Although, at 18 years old and at 36 years old, we begin to really bring in Rahu. And what happens is when we bring in Rahu, which is the opposite of Ketu, begin to realize how we've been holding on to Ketu too much. I often talk about Ketu as this, it's a security paradigm that we unconsciously perpetuate within ourselves. It is something we need, but we need it so badly in order to operate that we operate through it in a way that does the trick, that gives us just enough. And I often describe it as like a false pizza. It's like the crust is made out of cardboard, and you've shredded some paper to make it look like mozzarella. And, you've got, I don't know, pencil shavings for the Parmesan, but it's this thing that's not real. But you've created it for yourself because you want this pizza so bad. And this is such an important security paradigm for you that you will create this Frankenstein gross false pizza, this cardboard shredded paper pizza, and you'll eat it because your imagination in the soul desires this thing so badly that you will almost create a fantasy and stay in this fantasy eating this false pizza because that is it feels safer to us than, the imagination is very powerful. And you will stay in this false paradigm of Ketu for a long time, thinking that you need it so badly that it's the imagination, what the imagination creates, we hope, initially, is more powerful than what Ketu actually is. And then you realize when you're about 18, when you're 36, and especially in your 40s, Rahu comes along and you smell a real pizza. And you see pizza on TV, you see it in the store, and you look at it and it's, gosh, maybe that is good. But the unconscious almost can't take the thought that the pizza that it's had all this time, that there's something better. That this isn't it. I thought this was it. I've fallen in love with this. This is who I am. And then you see a real pizza and you almost don't want to believe it. And that's the unconscious flinches at it until you're about, again, these evolutionary times come into your life where Rahu especially makes you realize that this paper cardboard pizza you've been eating is not actually satisfying. But this is the strange, very uncomfortable thing that happens with Rahu and Ketu, especially when they mature. Rahu matures at 43, Ketu matures at 48. Now, I talk about this a lot in this series and in my work in general. You've probably heard it in my cold readings. Now, the evolutionary quadrants, the nodal quadrants, shows the slow unpeeling and unfurling of the process of realizing that the false pizza is actually not real and it's not serving you. And it's only keeping you locked in an experience that is not what you actually seek. Because we all actually truly seek Ketu. That pizza is the thing that we seek. But it takes Rahu and it takes a lifetime for you to recognize that the false phantom of what you've been seeking is not that thing. Then you got to let go of the false phantom. Now, part of what makes us desire the real pizza is getting sick of the false pizza. And this is what we mean when we say that when we are in Ketu-land, we're stuck at home with the false pizza. It's all we've ever known, but and it's we eat it, but we begin to get this sinking feeling. Okay, so imagine you're a kid at home and your parents are about to force you to go out into summer camp. Okay, so Timmy, it's time to go to summer camp. And you're like, no, I don't want to go to summer camp. It's too new. It's too Rahu. It's too strange. It's not what I've known. I've been so used to being at home. It's too intense. And then they whip you out there in a summer camp. Let's say you go there for 4 weeks. For the first 2 weeks, it's Rahu. It's too much, too powerful, too new all at once. I can't deal with this. I hate it. I wish I was back to my security paradigm, my false pizza. This cheese, and it's just all this all this real pizza. It's making me feel like the experience I had was bad. And my whole ego, my whole enterprise of life is being deflated by the summer camp. It's too new. But so then you come home, eventually after the 2 weeks in Rahu though, you start to get used to it. It's still painful. It's still tough. And even when you come out of there, the whole time it was kind of tough. But what happens when you come home, you spend 2 weeks back at home, and already you're missing the Rahu-land. Already you're missing summer camp. It's like, damn it, it was right there in front of me. Like it was actually so good there, so new. I actually loved it. And now I'm back in this hellhole, back at my home, back at my usual regular programmed reality. And then we get sick of Ketu again. Ketu feels fresh for a little bit, really. It's like, oh, thank God I'm home. But after a short amount of time, you get sick of home. But then when Rahu time comes up again, it's like intense. It's like, last time I did this, it was so traumatically different. I don't even know if I want to go through it again. But life whips us back into Rahu territory. Then we're in Rahu territory, and we're sick of it when we're in it. We wish for Ketu. And then we come back to Ketu, and it's refreshing for a little bit, but then we get sick of Ketu and we crave Rahu, right? This is the summer camp and the stuck at home duality of Rahu and Ketu. Now, when we're looking at transiting North Node, we observe the transiting North Node to get a sense of where karma seeks to go. Now, this is important to this node quadrant video. Your forward desire in life will lean towards the North Node eclipse for that year. At the present time, the North Node is in Aries, so we've been having eclipses when the sun has a new moon in Aries, right? That point of Aries is where the eclipses are happening. There's a forward motion for all of us this year in the sign of Aries. For better or worse, things we've always wanted to do related to Aries is unfolding for everybody this year. Now, of course, if there are eclipses happening in the transiting North Node, there are also going to be eclipses happening in the transiting South Node. We observe the transiting South Node to get a sense of necessary karmas emerging and destabilizing the platform you stand on while you risk towards the North Node. This is what I say when it comes to the Ketu eclipse. Again, if there's North Node eclipses happening in Aries, then that means there will also be South Node eclipses happening in Libra. Or any opposite, obviously, right? And they stay there for a year. So when we are in the North Node eclipse territory, especially during the year, the transiting of the North Node eclipse, there's this summer camp feeling, and you're really scratching into things you've always wanted to do. In fact, so much that it'll kind of eat away at Ketu a little bit, right? During the North Node eclipse, Ketu gets eaten away at. And then during the Ketu eclipse, Ketu also gets eaten away at, because we're trying so hard to move towards the North Node. But when there is a South Node eclipse, what happens is we're forced to reckon with the reasons why we have not jumped into Rahu, why we have not gone to summer camp, the things we have to deal with at home and fortify the fortress at home, lock the van before you go on your adventure, right? It's kind of like when things happen related to Ketu, the experience is that you make sure you'll check the door, you check it twice, you're making sure that the windows are closed, that no one can see inside the van, so you can confidently lock that van. So when you go out on the beach with your friends and you're playing volleyball, you're not wasting the whole time in Rahu at the beach on your adventure thinking, God, did I lock that van? Did I leave the oven on? Is my house on fire right now? Because this is what happens when people do not, remember, if you've been watching our Ganesha videos, the elephant's head has to keep moving. When you're in Ketu, this is your time to regenerate, to come back into yourself, to fortify the fortress, to lock the van. Check it twice. If you have a good Ketu and a good Mars is helpful to Ketu. If you have a good Mars and a good Ketu, you've got a good goalie. Mars is the goalie that makes sure nothing gets in. Nothing gets through your defenses. You've been checking and making sure that all the things related to the opposite of North Node, which is Ketu, the South Node, you've taken care of it all, even though it's annoying. It's routine. It's this thing I always do, but you make sure it's all figured out. And then when North Node time comes, when that North Node eclipse happens, you're going to have to use your resources, and things are going to happen that are so unknown and so new and so exciting and evolutionary that you have to use extra resources. You have to, resources, opportunities will come up in those moments that you want to have your fortress prepared, for when Rahu comes in. It's like it's an old, imagine a tribe, and the tribe, like a buffalo, is like the north node. If you're going to kill this buffalo, you got to make sure when you bring the buffalo meat back that everyone is ready, that everyone has been stewing in Ketu, stewing at the home fortress, making sure everything is all kind of still honky-dory, so that when we drag that buffalo back, we're all ready and we're prepared to take in this large quantity of meat. We lost a few men in order just to get the buffalo, or a few people are injured. We got to take care of the injuries. It's a big deal in a tribal people when they catch that buffalo and bring it home. So the fortress has to be prepared too, especially if Rahu comes and you're out, most of the party is out grabbing this buffalo. That's when the barbarians come in. That's when Ketu comes in and things destabilize because you're focused so much on this evolutionary opportunity. So these are both important, right? So every year, the transit of North Node and the South Node are both important times of the year. But ultimately, the North Node is what I am using here to show the evolutionary opportunities that are popping up where karma is moving forward progressively. So we observe the transiting North Node to get a sense of where karma seeks to go, right? Your forward desire in life leans towards the North Node eclipse that year. And this is why we can see, this is the North Node quadrants that we're going to see, A, B, C, and D. Then E and F represent the squares. Okay. Now this looks confusing. It's going to make more sense as soon as I just show you this. Okay. So we're born 0 years old, or let's say this is also at 18. But let's say 0 years old, your North Node is at its natal place. About a year later, it goes into the next sign. About a year later, it goes into the next sign. Between 0 and 4.5 years old, the North Node is moving backwards in your chart. You all ought to know that, let me just see if you guys can see me here. You all ought to know when planets are moving forward, they're moving, this way. First house, second house, third house, fourth house. It's going down and to the right and then up and to the left. But the North Node transits backwards and the South Node transits backwards. So in the first 0 to 4.5 years, the North Node is transiting quadrant A after the North Node. And of course, that means that the South Node is in quadrant C. Then at 4.5 years old, the North Node is at its first square. Then we have 4.5 years to 9 years. The North Node is in quadrant B. So now the North Node in the North Node eclipses, right? Wherever it is, it's done with the square. Now the North Node is in this sign, and the South Node is opposite to it, and there are eclipses happening that year, right? In that sign. Next year, it'll still be in quadrant B probably. Next year, it'll still probably be in quadrant B. And then next year, after that, after about 9 years from when you're born, the North Node hits your natal Ketu, and there are eclipses where your natal Ketu is. For the example of me, I'm going to show the example of me here. My South Node is in Cancer, right? So at this point in my journey, let's say the North Node is in Cancer and there are eclipses happening in Cancer, right? That was happening when I was 9 years old. Then from 9 to 13.5, we are in quadrant C, where the North Node is now past the opposition and it's moving back to Rahu territory, to Rahu-land. And of course, the South Node is also moving in lockstep opposite, right? 13.5 years old, the North Node makes its final square before coming back into quadrant D. So now the North Node has been in Ketu territory for the last 9 years or whatever it is, the last 13.5 years, right? So now it'd be the last 9 years. After square F, it's been 9 years. Yeah. So now the North Node in transit and the North Node eclipses are happening in quadrant D. For me, this was like, again, this coming from the South Node, then the North Node is moving backwards into Aries, and now this is where I actually am. I'm 32 years old right now. Now the North Node is in quadrant D, and it's moving up to another nodal return. So I'm going to show an example of my own chart to make this make a little bit more sense. Now I want to remind everybody that things advance most progressively, for better or for worse, when Rahu is in Rahu territory, right? That's quadrant D and quadrant A, and Ketu is in Ketu territory, right? So when the North Node is in quadrant D and quadrant A, it's Rahu being in Rahu territory of your own. It's closer to your natal Rahu than it is to your natal Ketu. That's when things advance most progressively, for better or for worse, depending on if you've got a good Saturn and a good Rahu placement, and a good Mars and a good Ketu placement. That's something I probably should have mentioned in this series. I get this from Ernst Wilhelm. Ketu is related to Mars, and Rahu is related to Saturn. It's progression, it's movement forward. Mars is protection and making sure our needs are figured out, and using urgency through Mars to make sure that what I absolutely need to feel comfortable and happy and safe through Ketu is figured out. Saturn is progressive in this way, which is interesting. Now, there is equal importance in the soul. Let's remember, when the North Node is in quadrant B and quadrant C, when the North Node is in Ketu's territory, there's equal importance there when the nodes are in their opposite territory. Again, if you've been watching our Ganesha parts of this series, the metaphor here is that the elephant's head never stops moving. There's always good hash to be made out of the present moment. When you're in quadrant B and C, you're probably not going to be advancing your soul like you might want to. But there's important things happening there when the North Node is in quadrant B and C. When the North Node eclipses are happening closer to your natal Ketu, that means that you're digging into your roots. And, there's a mix. North Node is in the South Node land. So it's not going to be as progressive, but it's still just as important to the soul. That's why you got to watch my Ganesha videos to basically, Ganesha's message is that right now needs to happen in order that tomorrow can come about fruitfully. Right? Very important. Now, this is a sort of an example that you guys would have seen in my other videos, right? So this is the transiting nodes and eclipses. Here we have Dustin's chart. I'm a Leo rising, and I have Ketu in the 12th house, Rahu in the 6th house of Capricorn, right? Now this year, I'm 32 years old. The transiting Rahu is in the sign of Aries, and this is a square to my natal nodes, right? And this is 2023. Pretty much next year, it's going to be 2024. The North Node is going to be having eclipses occur in the sign of Pisces, and the South Node is going to be inside the sign of Virgo. So the North Node eclipses are happening in Pisces in 2024. Of course, now at this point, if you've been following, Rahu at present is in F for me. Now it's moving into quadrant D, where the transiting North Node is coming closer to my natal North Node, right? So this is 2023. This is the square. Now the transiting North Node is moving towards my natal North Node. This area is now the backwards moving North Node eclipses have entered quadrant D and Rahu territory for me, right? Pretty much 2024. 2025, I think I've got this a bit mixed up, actually. I do. I think that the transiting north node will be in Pisces close to 2025. Then 2026, it'll be in Aquarius. I digress. 2026, probably closer to 2027. I'm going to be about 36 years old, and this will be my north node return. Let's see. 2026. I was born 1991, so 2026 would be 35. So it would be more like 2027. That kind of sucks, but whatever. You guys see the point. The north node is going to be transiting over my natal Rahu in Capricorn. There will be eclipses in Capricorn at this point, and those eclipses are going to be very important to my evolutionary progression and what I want to do with my life. But of course, I've got to deal with Ketu in Cancer destabilizing at that point. Hopefully the work I did back in 2018, 2019, when there was a nodal flip, hopefully I locked the van. And the things I dealt with at that time are going to protect me and sustain me while I go off into the unknown at age 36. Now, these things can be found in this evolutionary calendar. At 18 years old, there's the first nodal return. Then at 27, in between here, there's another square. And then at 27, there's a nodal opposition that happens right around the same time as the Saturn return and as Mars matures. At 32, which I am at now, there's this nodal square. And then 4 years later, 4.5 years later, at 36, we have the second nodal return. Now, these nodal returns are very special and important. And this is what the full figure looks like, right? So check out how old you are, and you'll be able to see. I got to check if you guys can see me. Good. Check out how old you are, however old you are, and you're going to be able to find yourself in this backwards revolving cycle. Let's say random age if you're 54. 54 years old, you're in quadrant D, and that's actually right at the square, right? 54 is not a square actually, but a north node return. That's your third north node return. Let's say 25. I'm just throwing random numbers out here. 25. So we're in quadrant B. So in quadrant B at about 25, you've pretty much left the first square, and now the north node is in Ketu territory. Really throughout most of your 20s, from basically 22 till about 31, the north node is dealing with locking the van, getting all that stuff figured out in Ketu-land. Now, keep in mind that any natal planets in each of these quadrants will have karma associated with that leg of the journey. Not only from the time you're born, at the time you're born, there's very deep north node things just impressed into your consciousness just from where your north node is. So there'll be interesting evolutionary pattern repetition that occurs when, for example, you're 18 or you're 36, you have your north node return, and then, now the north node is going to move into quadrant A. And if you've got Moon, Venus, and Saturn here, as it shows here, there's going to be karma that is brought up, not only related to those planets, but also related to how those planets relate to the north node by sign, by house, by everything, by aspect, their relationship to the north node lord, etc. So this will show up especially during the entire period of a transiting north or south node eclipse visiting that quadrant. So really those planets are going to be kind of relevant the whole time the north node is in a quadrant where those natal planets exist. I could show the example of my own chart. We can kind of see Saturn, for example, is in quadrant A. So the whole time that the north node is transiting Pisces, Aries, and even Capricorn, the north node is going to be kind of working on Saturn at that point. Furthermore, this even goes to say that the north node is actually working with all the planets on its side. when it's in that zone. For me, as we can see, I've got a crazy bowl chart. The only planets that are on Ketu's side are Jupiter and Venus. And there's interesting things to talk about there, but it's not for this video to discuss. Really, I'm still scratching into this work. I would look into Ernst Wilhelm to look a bit more into how this would unfold. But I'm going to be learning from Ernst and peeling it away in my own time on my own channel. So let's start finally digging into these quadrants a little bit, right? So we've been discussing, showing these examples. Now it's time to kind of really finally unfold frame for frame what these quadrants mean. I'm going to show you a very important slide next. We'll start to digest and see how this works. But let's just look at quadrant A and D as one unit, and then quadrant B and C are just this whole other unit, right? So during the North Node eclipses transiting quadrant D and A, the North Node eclipses are occurring in the realm, in the territory of your natal Rahu, right? So right now, I'm 32 years old, as we know. And at 32, as we can see from here, at 32 years old, let's see, we are leaving quadrant C. We just have, as we've shown, I'm at 32. The North Node in Aries is square to my natal Ketu and Rahu in Cancer and Capricorn. I'm 32, and the node transiting Rahu is in Aries. Then it's going to move towards quadrant D, which is moving closer to my natal Rahu, right? So that's what we're talking about. At 32, you enter into quadrant D. The North Node enters quadrant D, where the transiting North Node eclipses are going to happen. And they're going to be building up and building up, each one like a karmic tar pit, sucking karma closer and closer into my natal North Node. Now at quadrant D, as we can see, we're building up to the peak. And then at quadrant A, we're receding from the peak. So quadrant D, it's a tension point where the desire to spring away from Ketu. This is remember that in my 20s, just like all of us, the North Node eclipses were transiting in Ketu's territory. And so I've been at home, stuck at home, bored and stagnant, locking the van, checking it twice, making sure that all of my ducks are in a row. And now I'm 32 and the wind is cleared. I've left my Saturn return. And so now I'm moving into D. I have this desire to spring away from the homesickness of home and go to summer camp, away from the root regeneration in the fortress of Ketu. And that's especially the biggest, that's what makes me want to try and taste the real pizza, is the fact that I'm sick of the security paradigm that I've been trying to, stabilize. It's the desire that is coming through me to get away from what I've always done and to come into who I truly am. So this is quadrant D, a very important time for all of us. Really, this is the springboard of inspiration and evolution and really clever figuring out who you deeply are. And when it gets to the peak of the North Node return, there's a very important experience of a peak of being who you are. Now, usually what happens when the North Node eclipses start to happen in quadrant A, this is when you're kind of now being pulled away from summer camp, and it already feels like, oh no, it was too short. It didn't last long enough. We're going to kind of explain how that kind of happened to me 18 years ago. In quadrant A, you're coasting from leaping into the unknown. Peak Rahu energy. And after the peak Rahu energy, you're leaving the peak, you're feeling a shift in trajectory, And at this time, even though it feels like, you've kind of left the period of being done with Ketu. You've been cooking in Rahu, you've been cooking at summer camp for a while. Now, if this is a 4-week stay in summer camp, you've gone past the 2-week period, the homesickness is over, and now you just want to squeeze summer camp for all it's worth. Now I'm finally here, I'm in the flow, I'm with my friends, I'm back. I remember what summer camp is like. Now I'm squeezing it for all it's worth. Until eventually, so at some point, the square happens again, the first square of the series, the square between A and B. And it's at that point that we realize that we have to come home. We have to come back to regenerate, check that no barbarians ransacked the place while we were gone, check that we locked the van, right? And this is when we move towards Ketu-land, which is quadrant B and quadrant C. Now, before we get into that, I want to remind you all that it can be very therapeutic to remember the last time the nodes were situated in a similar way to the present moment. You do so by checking what things were like for you about 18 years ago. If you're 32, like I am, think of what things are like for you when you were about 14 years old. It can be very subtle, but if you really feel it out, it's very good exercise to track your evolutionary arcs and understand them as they come, right? Now, I wanted to take this opportunity. We could dig in and start talking about quadrant B and C, but while we're in the heat of it, we just talked about Rahu. Let's have a little bit of fun here. So this is my beloved friend Astro Theme. You just look up, what I do. If you ever want to see this, you look up Google, you look up transits, ephemerides. It's probably one of my most searched things in Google. Then you'll click it. It should come up as Astro Theme. Planetary transits, ephemerides. And voila, here we have it. So this is the current date, right? It's 2024. So I'm just going to go, you go to the browse option, and it gives you options for the different things, the different amounts of time that you can change. I'm going to go 6 years backward. 6 years. I'm going to go backward another 6 years, and then backward another 6 years. So at the present time here, we would actually probably want to go back one more year. So we've gone back about 19 years, and what we see here is that the North Node is in the sign of Aries. This is August 17th, 2005. Now, I think I graduated school around 2009. That was the summer of 2009. So in the summer of 2005, I would have been coming out of grade 8 and going into grade 9. So this is 9th grade in high school. So this is a high school. Obviously, at this particular time for me, which, yeah, this is the square that happens for everybody at this time. So pretty much, that's interesting. The North Node coming to its first, not its first square, but its first time going into quadrant D. We would be about, let's see, in 2005, I was 14, right? Are we running here? Quadrant D, 14, right? So at 14 years old, we're all just coming into high school. I think that's very interesting that high school represents us getting kicked into Rahu-land after having been in Ketu territory for the last 9 years or so, right? So now at 14 years old, you're kicked into high school. You're kicked into quadrant D. Now, interestingly enough for me, I'm going to go ahead another, I didn't even plan that. That's kind of cool that worked out that way. Okay, so I'm going to go, the next thing I want to seek is the next square. So I'm going to go ahead 1 year. Now the North Node is in Pisces. I'm going to go ahead another year. The North Node is at the beginning of Pisces. Go ahead another year. The North Node is in Aquarius. Go ahead another year. 2009. The North Node is just about to peak into Capricorn. right? So this is 2009. This is 4 years later. For shits and giggles, let's go forward one more year. And now this is the North Node in Capricorn in 2010. This is my first year out of high school. Now, from 2010 till 2014, 2015, if you guys know me, I'm a musician, I'm a writer, I'm an artist, and I did something at that time that's still out there if you're interested. Gosh, I did something that took a lot of time. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we're shooting the shit here. Let's see. Billy Oyster Silver Ship. So I created something called Billy Oyster and the Silver Ship. And when you go to it, you can check it out. And this is this whole album that I created with a bunch of my friends. Can you guys see it here? No, you can't. So you look up Billy Oyster and the Silver Ship on YouTube, and it's this. And it was a lot of time, a lot of my energy from 2013, 2014, and into 2015. It was all Rahu. It was this intense creative period in my life. At that time, I was getting into learning how to record. So this is from 2010 to 2015. So at this time, I'm out of high school now. 2009, I finished high school. 2010, I started coming into myself. This is a peak Rahu energy at this point. There would have been an eclipse in December, January at this time. Now, I wasn't even fully peaking on my creative energy, but in 2011, I bought a computer where I could record my own music. I started doing poetry. I started writing, and I started this intense creative process that really I squeezed to death, which I talk about in my book that's coming up. I squeezed it to death right about till 2015. Then at 2015, what started to happen is that I really ran out of steam and my creativity wasn't going anywhere. Billy Oyster, this thing that I put in so much energy into, I had friends to help me, but I was just too young out of the gates. What I tried to do there I was not prepared to really fully come through with it. Something, creatively a lot happened for me. I gained a lot of powerful premonitions of what I feel myself doing in the future as a creative person, as an artist. But I burned out like crazy during this period, right? And this was again 2015. Now the North Node is in Libra, right? So we've gone from the peak. Now it's 2015 when I would have been 1991, 2001, 2011, 24, 25, right? So now let's look at our picture here. 25 years old. 22 to 20, you're right. So really when I was about 22 years old, which had been about 2013, I was coming into Quadrant B. So just to get this right, I've got to make sure I've got my dates and everything figured out here. 2015 is when the North Node was really square, and I was about, again, 23 actually at this time. So, you got to use, this is why I'm showing you guys, don't just take my word for these dates, because the North Node, if you're born with the North Node way at the end or the beginning, these dates aren't going to be exact. You got to use your own discretion. Look at the ephemerides yourself. Use the free technology to your advantage here, folks. And, so 2015, the North Node was in Libra, really even 2014. And in 2014, I turned 23 in November of 2014. So in August of 2014, which is what this is showing, where the North Node was already well into Libra, I was about 23 years old. So it does kind of work out. But I digress. I think I just did a lot of self-validating there. Let's get back on track here. The whole point is that at this time in 2014, we know that my natal nodes are on Cancer and Capricorn. So the peak happened when it was 2010. The North Node was on Capricorn. Then in 2015, about 4.5 years later, the North Node eclipses were happening in Libra. So this was now the E square turning into quadrant B. And it was in quadrant B that I hit a wall creatively. Billy Oyster wasn't coming through. I actually became very depressed at this time, but this was also because I was going through something called Sati Sati. I hit a huge creative wall at this time. And it wasn't until, I went through all of this right up to the point of 2019, which is when I'm just going to, what the heck, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of this story, and I don't want to take too much of this for my own personal thing. 2019, 4 years later from that square, the North Node was in another square. So in 2019, I was 28. At 28 years old, we are in quadrant C at this point, and we're dealing with, we're at the nodal opposition at about 27 years old, right? 27, 28. So at that time, when the North Node was back in Cancer, now my South Node is in Cancer. So in 2019, when the North Node was in Cancer, I experienced a time of, I moved home to live with a bunch of people, and I'd kind of let my artistic desire for Billy Oyster and a lot of the recording music stuff, I let that all go slide because I needed to live with people, come back to my Ketu roots, come back to not being so industrial Capricorn, right? Because that's where my North Node is. The whole time, the North Node, the whole time the North Node was in the area of Capricorn, I was very industrial, trying to move forward in my life progressively with Capricorn things. Now, at this time in 2019, we're peaking in Ketu-land. And at that point, I broke, it's like I was settling into home. I started living with a bunch of friends in a hippie house, and I got out of the basement that I was living in, where my mom was living and my family was living. Started paying rent with a bunch of chosen friends in a chosen tribe, which was still very difficult, but the best thing I ever did. That Ketu period was very important for me. So it goes to show you that this B and C, especially the nodal opposition, was such a karmic deck clearing for me. Very important time. I finally looked into my fortress and was checking out all the things that were not making me capable of going the farthest that I could in Rahu territory. And like I said, I hope I've done a lot of good work in quadrant B in my 20s. Because I'm hungry for Rahu now that I'm 32. So the whole point here is look in the past. Whatever age you're at, I'm 32, so I can look back in the past and start seeing these patterns. If you're still in your 20s, it might be harder to look back 18 years ago and really get a lot of useful data. But look back 18 years ago, whatever stage you're on, and start to see the patterns, because you're going to repeat these patterns. So now we know that once the North Node was in Capricorn, it eventually went to Libra in 2015, and I had this huge burnout phase from 2015 to 2019. That was quadrant B for me. Okay? Now the North Node is transiting in closer to Ketu when you starting at about 22 years old. Right? Especially at 22, you're going to get the first square. And then after that square, for me, that was the North Node coming into Libra, because my natal South Node is in Cancer. Right. So anyway, the North Node enters quadrant B. The transiting North Node eclipses, when they get into here at about 22 years old onward, there's a tension point. where Ketu really starts to become initiated. Now, energy has peaked in Rahu territory, and you're almost like, oh, don't take me away from summer camp. Don't take me away from, in my case, the creativity that I had there. With Billy Oyster, all these people, everything was moving for me perfectly with Rahu, and I didn't want to let it go. Now the person must reclaim their roots by halting their path and looking within. Seeing what they have not dealt with for a long time, seeing what was stopping them from progressing in the last Rahu picture. And this is usually the most, loud energy of quadrant B. Is what wasn't I doing in Rahu that was stopping me from living my best life and being the best I can in the Rahu period, right? So that's quadrant B. Then we have the nodal opposition. Like for me, it's when the North Node transiting eclipses started happening in first they were in Leo because it moves backwards. Then it happened in Cancer, the sign of Cancer. The North Node being in Cancer, where my natal Ketu is, that's when I left home, went to live with a bunch of friends, and just get into my soul. Of course, it's going to have to do with the sign, too. I was dealing with a lot of Cancer karma. Cancer being your home, but also your heart, your emotional cardinal energy, which is a place where my Ketu, that's my pizza. That's my favorite thing that I don't want anybody to fuck with. But I had to break out of it, and I completely broke out of the house I was in for years and went and lived with people and didn't even think about Rahu and personal progression at all. Although, by living with other people, I lived with other musicians who have completely made me think differently about my Rahu period. So the Ketu period is very important for Ketu and Rahu. Then in quadrant C, we're completing the Ketu phase. We're coasting on this regenerated energy, taking care of loose ends, fortifying the fortress, locking the van. And this is when the desire for more risky, fun, soul-progressing adventure begins to stir. And this happens really from quadrant C. It's about 27 when the nodal opposition happens. You enter your Saturn return. And there's this combined with the Saturn return at 30, from 28 to 32. It's a very important time in everybody's life where they're gearing up for the next Rahu phase, right? Plus they're dealing with Saturn return at that time. Quadrant C, it was going to be different for 28 years old than it will be at 45. But 45 is a very important time too, because that's when you're dealing with midlife crisis energy, Ketu and Rahu maturing, etc. So I'm sure it's got its own ugliness involved there. Ugliness, but important ugliness. Looking the jewel in the face, as it were. Right? Now, of course, you watch my new moon transits video. It's going to be called Eclipses, Nodes, and New Moon Transits, something like that. Because the transiting new moon every year has a relevant thing relative to these quadrants as well. So I've probably shown you in my other videos, when the new moon happens in these quadrants close to your natal nodes, and of course this is running ahead. This is running like the regular. So the new moon, let's say for me, this is Capricorn. So then this would be the new moon in Aquarius. And then this would be the new moon in Pisces. And then there's a new moon in Aries that's square to my nodes. Every year around the time of April, I feel a shift going where the new moon then happens in Taurus, then it happens in Gemini, and then it peaks in, of course, the summer solstice. When there's a new moon in the sign of Cancer, I've got to deal with my Ketu energy. So then this is a whole new type of quadrants here, right? But it means the same thing, and I've matched them up to be the same way, right? Quadrant D, you're heading up. So this, for me, quadrant D would be like when the new moon happens. The square would happen in Libra, and then the new moon happens in Scorpio, my birthday. And then the new moon happens in Sagittarius, and then the new moon happens in Capricorn, and that is peak Rahu energy. So beginning from October and ending in April, the new moon is happening in my Rahu territory. Quadrant D resonates, and then Quadrant A resonates, right? In Quadrant D, I'm coming out of Ketu-land, initializing Rahu, intuitive desires, growth, risk, anxiety. But eventually in Quadrant A, I've been in summer camp. After Christmas time is a very important creative period for me, right up till April, right? After Christmas, I call it the cream. I'm coasting on the creative inspiration at a peak, right? Then in April, there's a new moon in Aries. There's another square. And then after April, the new moon occurs in Quadrant B. It's beginning Ketu-tary, reflection on self, passion, purpose. There's a bit of resistance involved there, but it's a necessary release from April till summer solstice, till July. Then in summer solstice, there's a new moon in Cancer, and I accept it. I let it go. I just allow myself to come into all the difficult resistance associated with my natural natal Ketu, which a lot of times has to do with love, has to do with friends, because I want to be so industrial Capricorn all the time. When the new moon happens in July in the sign of Cancer, I have been learning to open my heart to the summer, to having fun with people, to not thinking about my Saturnian future so much. And of course, it's at those times that I get the most inspiration for Rahu. That's just how it goes, Quadrant C, we are finally letting, for me, this would be after the Cancer, where my natal Ketu is. There's a new moon in Leo, new moon in Virgo, and then there's a new moon in Libra. And then after that, it starts again in Rahu-land, right? There's a lot there. Hopefully you guys can see me. Yes, very good. So there's a whole lot to this world. We can see, this has been my video on the Nodal Quadrants. This is a huge key dimension of evolutionary astrology, really, and the evolving arcs of the unfolding nodes as they relate to our own personal journey and as they relate to the ever-unfolding evolutionary map that I call the age-based transits, the age-based astrological patterns, as we can see here. The evolutionary script, aka the evolutionary calendar. So do yourself a favor, watch that evolutionary script video again, check out the total script, and see how you can start placing all of the pieces from the script into your own personal life. And the script will always have it. So thanks again for watching, everybody. If you feel so inclined, I did a lot of work on this series. I do it, I always say tips are never expected, but always appreciated. I love doing this work. I'm in Rahu-land now, and this is partly why I think this stuff's coming through me. There's probably more to come. If you feel so inclined, you can donate to my channel here through the PayPal link available in the description box of this video. It's paypal.me/DustinCormier91. You would be helping me to continue, do my thing, write my books, create the creative efforts that I do. I'm coming into Rahu-land, so I'm hoping that it's going to be put to good use. But I digress. I love you, folks. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Dustin Cormier, and this has been another episode of How to Rock Astrology. I'm going to leave you once more with this picture again. Feel free to pause this, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this away for the moment. Ooh, hopefully I can get that back later, but yeah, whatever. Feel free to pause this, take a screenshot of this evolutionary calendar, use it to your best advantage, and I'll see you at my cold readings. When I'm going through my cold readings and I'm talking about these things, now you'll be able to see a little bit more of the language that I'm using when I'm discussing somebody's astrology reading and using transits and ephemerides and the age-based astrological patterns. Hope you guys enjoy. Thanks for watching. Peace and love.